My name is Lauren Mitchell, and I am 36 years old. I used to believe that being gentle was a form of safety. I believed that if I stayed soft enough, quiet enough, understanding enough, nothing truly bad could happen to me. That belief was planted early, watered daily, and protected by the people who were supposed to love me the most. I did not realize then that what I called gentleness, my family would one day recognize as weakness. And once they did, everything changed. I grew up learning how to read rooms before I learned how to trust myself. I could sense tension in the air the way other kids sensed rain coming. A shift in tone, a door closed too softly, a laugh that sounded just a little forced. I learned to adjust myself accordingly. I became smaller when things felt fragile. I became helpful when silence felt dangerous. I became agreeable when disagreement felt like abandonment. No one told me to do this. I just learned that love stayed longer when I didn't cause trouble. In my family, I was known as the easy one, the calm one, the one who didn't need much. That label followed me everywhere, and I wore it like proof that I was doing something right. I didn't ask for attention. I didn't complain. I didn't demand explanations. I absorbed disappointment quietly and turned it inward, telling myself that understanding others was more important than being understood. I didn't know that every time I did that, I was teaching them how far they could push me. Pain in my house was never loud. There were no dramatic explosions, no obvious villains. Everything happened in lowered voices and meaningful pauses. Disapproval came disguised as concern. Control came disguised as love. When I was hurt, it was framed as me being too sensitive. When I cried, it was proof that I couldn't handle reality. So I learned to cry alone. I learned to process everything in private. I learned that my emotions were inconvenient and best kept hidden. By the time I was a teenager, my weakness had become obvious to everyone but me. I was the one who took responsibility when things went wrong, even when they weren't my fault. I was the one who apologized first just to end the tension. I was the one who smoothed things over so everyone else could move on without discomfort. And every time I did that, something inside me broke a little more quietly. I remember one specific moment when I was 16, standing in my bedroom after being blamed for something I didn't do. I had accepted it without argument, nodded along, said I understood. When the door closed, I sat on my bed and felt a tightness in my chest that I didn't have words for yet. It wasn't shame, it wasn't guilt. It was the realization that my pain had solved a problem for everyone else. That realization stayed with me, even though I tried to ignore it. As I grew older, the pattern didn't change. It deepened. My family came to rely on my weakness. When conflict appeared, I was the buffer. When emotions ran high, I was expected to stay calm. When someone needed to be forgiven, I was the one who forgave. When something needed to be endured, I endured it. They called me strong for surviving what they kept putting on my shoulders. I mistook that praise for love. What I didn't understand was that my weakness made things easier for them. It allowed them to avoid accountability. It gave them permission to offload discomfort. It meant they never had to look too closely at their own behavior, because I was always willing to look inward instead. My self-doubt became their shield. My empathy became their excuse. I spent years believing that if I just loved better, tried harder, stayed softer, things would eventually even out. I believed that families were meant to hurt sometimes, and that endurance was part of loyalty. I didn't know that loyalty was only being asked of me. I didn't know that my role had been decided long before I was old enough to question it. The most painful part wasn't the obvious moments of neglect or dismissal. It was the quiet understanding that my value was tied to how much I could tolerate. I was loved as long as I didn't disrupt the balance, as long as I didn't ask for too much, as long as I remained useful. The moment I needed something, the moment I faltered, the warmth cooled just enough for me to feel it. By the time I reached my 30s, I was exhausted in a way rest couldn't fix. I carried the emotional weight of my family like it was my responsibility to hold everyone together. I felt guilty for being tired, guilty for wanting space, guilty for imagining a life where I wasn't constantly bracing myself. I thought something was wrong with me for feeling this way. I didn't realize that I was finally responding to years of being used. My weakness was never that I was fragile. It was that I believed love required sacrifice without limits. And my family learned exactly how to test those limits without ever admitting they existed. They learned that my silence meant permission, that my understanding meant agreement, that my forgiveness meant they never had to change. I didn't wake up one day and suddenly see all of this clearly. It crept in slowly, through moments of confusion and quiet heartbreak, through nights where I lay awake wondering why I felt so alone in a room full of people who shared my blood, through the growing awareness that something fundamental was wrong, even if I couldn't yet name it. This is where my story really begins. Not with anger, not with confrontation, but with the first crack in the belief that my weakness made me safe. Because once that belief broke, everything else was destined to follow. Silence had followed me for so long that it felt natural, like breathing. I didn't experience it as absence. I experienced it as instruction. Silence told me when I had crossed an invisible line. Silence told me when I needed to fix something I didn't understand. Silence told me when love was being pulled away, slowly and deliberately, so no one else would notice. In my family, silence was never accidental. It arrived after questions, after hesitation, after moments when I almost said how I felt, but stopped halfway. It came wrapped in calm expressions and polite distance. No one raised their voice. No one explained what I had done wrong. I was simply left to figure it out on my own, and I always did, because I was trained to. I became hyper-aware of emotional shifts. I noticed when texts became shorter, when phone calls ended sooner than usual, when laughter sounded forced, when I walked into a room and felt like I had interrupted something, even when no one said a word. My body learned these cues before my mind did. My chest tightened. My stomach sank. My thoughts raced, searching for whatever mistake I must have made. That was the power of silence. It didn't need proof. It didn't need clarity. It worked because it made me responsible for restoring peace, even when I didn't know what I had broken. I started apologizing without knowing why. Sometimes I would say sorry just to see if warmth returned. Often it did. A smile, a softer tone, a sense of normalcy restored. That taught me everything. My pain was the currency. My confusion was the cost. If I paid it quickly enough, harmony returned. What I didn't realize was that silence was shaping me. It was teaching me to doubt my instincts, teaching me that discomfort meant I was wrong, teaching me that asking for clarity was dangerous. Over time, I stopped asking questions altogether. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped checking whether my feelings were valid. I assumed they weren't. When I tried to express hurt, the response was always measured and devastating. I was told I was reading too much into things, that I was sensitive, that I always took things personally. The conversations were calm, but the message was clear. My emotions were the problem, not the behavior that caused them. So I learned to manage myself instead of the situation. I learned to swallow reactions before they surfaced. I learned to rehearse conversations in my head that I never had. I learned to carry emotional weight quietly so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. Silence rewarded me when I complied. It punished me when I didn't. By my mid-20s, I was exhausted in ways I couldn't explain to anyone. I wasn't overworked. I wasn't surrounded by chaos. From the outside, my life looked stable. Inside, I was constantly bracing for emotional fallout. I lived on alert, anticipating disappointment before it arrived. My nervous system never rested. Family gatherings became performances. I watched my words carefully. I edited my reactions. I smiled through discomfort because I knew what happened if I didn't. Silence would follow me home. Silence would sit beside me for days. Silence would make me question myself until I gave in and reached out, apologizing for the unspoken crime of having feelings. What hurt the most was how reasonable it all seemed. No one insulted me. No one screamed. No one openly rejected me. They just withdrew. And withdrawal is powerful when you're afraid of losing connection. I was terrified of being labeled difficult, terrified of being seen as the problem. Silence made sure of that. There were moments when I almost trusted myself, small sparks of anger, flickers of clarity, but they never lasted. Silence always won. It whispered that I was overreacting, that I was imagining things, that if everyone else seemed fine, the issue had to be me. And because I cared more about belonging than being right, I believed it. Slowly, my weakness evolved. It wasn't just gentleness anymore. It was self-erasure. I became someone who asked for permission emotionally, someone who waited to see how others felt before deciding how I was allowed to feel, someone who didn't trust her own memory of events because it conflicted with the calm certainty of everyone else. I didn't realize that silence had become a tool of control, that it kept me compliant without confrontation, that it allowed my family to avoid difficult conversations while still shaping my behavior. They didn't need to tell me who to be. I learned it myself, trying desperately to stay connected. The scariest part is how normal it felt, how easily it blended into daily life, how convincing it was. I thought this was what maturity looked like. I thought this was what love required. I thought learning to endure quietly meant I was growing. I didn't know I was shrinking. There were nights I lay awake replaying interactions, trying to decode meaning from pauses and tone shifts. Nights where I promised myself I would speak up next time, only to feel my throat close when the moment came. Silence had trained my body as much as my mind. It had taught me that speaking came with consequences. And still, I stayed. I stayed because silence didn't feel like abuse. It felt like distance I needed to earn my way back from. It felt like motivation to do better. It felt like proof that if I just adjusted myself enough, things would be okay again. I didn't yet understand that silence was never meant to protect me. It was meant to shape me. And one day soon, it would be used not just to control my behavior, but to rewrite my place in the family entirely. I realized my family had turned against me didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, the way everything painful in my life always had. So quietly that at first, I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. It started with distance. Not sudden, not dramatic. Just enough to make me question myself. Messages that went unanswered longer than usual. Conversations that felt careful, edited. Plans made without me, then explained away as misunderstandings. I told myself not to overthink it. I reminded myself that everyone was busy, that life gets complicated, that this was normal. But something felt different. The silence had changed. It wasn't corrective anymore. It was collective. I remember the moment it became undeniable. I had reached out to one family member, trying to clear the air about something small that had been bothering me. I chose my words carefully, as I always did. I wasn't accusing. I wasn't emotional. I was calm, respectful, measured. The response I received was polite, distant, and strangely final. They told me they were hurt. They told me I needed to reflect. They told me space was necessary. No specifics. No conversation. Just judgment. That's when I noticed it wasn't just one person. The same tone echoed everywhere. Different voices, same message. I was the problem. I was the source of tension. I had done something wrong, and everyone seemed to agree on that, even though no one could tell me exactly what it was. I felt panic rise in my chest. Not anger. Not defensiveness. Panic. Because I knew this territory. I had lived here my whole life. This was the moment where my weakness would decide everything. I searched myself desperately for guilt. I replayed conversations over and over, trying to find the flaw that explained this reaction. I assumed there had to be one. There always was. I apologized. Not once. Not clearly. But in fragments. In soft messages. In careful words meant to reopen doors without challenging the story already forming about me. I took responsibility for hurt I didn't understand. I validated feelings that were never explained to me. I hoped that if I was gentle enough, the warmth would return. It didn't. Instead, my apologies became confirmation. My confusion became proof. My vulnerability became evidence that I was unstable, dramatic, too much. I could feel the narrative solidifying without me present. Decisions were being made in rooms I wasn't invited into. Conclusions were being drawn without my voice. The most shocking part wasn't that they believed something negative about me. It was how easily they aligned. People who rarely agreed on anything suddenly spoke with certainty. Years of quiet frustration, unresolved resentment, and unspoken comparison found a shared outlet. Me. I wasn't confronted. I wasn't accused directly. I was simply repositioned. From family member to problem. From participant to subject. And once that shift happened, everything I said was filtered through it. If I tried to explain, I was defensive. If I stayed quiet, I was guilty. There was no safe response left. I remember sitting alone one night, staring at my phone, realizing no one was coming to ask for my side of the story. No one was curious. No one was confused. They were certain, and that certainty hurt more than any argument ever could. I felt a deep physical ache in my chest, like grief without a funeral. I was mourning something I couldn't name yet. Not just the current situation, but the belief that my family would protect me, that they would question each other, that they would hesitate before hurting me. That belief collapsed all at once. My weakness had made this possible. My history of taking blame made the story believable. My silence made it convenient. They didn't need evidence. They had precedent. I had trained them to expect compliance, and now that expectation worked against me. I withdrew after that, not out of strategy, out of survival. I didn't have the energy to keep offering myself up for judgment. Every interaction felt dangerous. Every word felt like it could be twisted. So I went quiet, but this time it wasn't obedience, it was shock. In that quiet, I began to see things clearly for the first time. I noticed how little effort anyone made to understand me. I noticed how quickly they were willing to let me go. I noticed how conditional my place had always been. And the realization was devastating. I wasn't losing them because of one mistake. I was losing them because my role had changed. I was no longer useful in the way I used to be. My weakness, once a tool they relied on, was now inconvenient because it raised questions they didn't want to answer. That night, something fractured inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to change the shape of everything going forward. I didn't know what would come next. I only knew that the family I thought I belonged to had already moved on without me. And I was about to face the most painful question of all. Who was I if I stopped trying to earn my place? I stopped sharing my thoughts altogether. I stopped reacting honestly. I filtered every word before it left my mouth, even when no one was listening. I convinced myself that if I stayed neutral enough, agreeable enough, invisible enough, things would eventually settle. I believed this was temporary, that I just needed to endure it a little longer. That belief cost me more than I realized. I began doubting everything about myself. My memory, my instincts, my emotional responses. If something hurt, I told myself it shouldn't. If something felt unfair, I reminded myself that I was probably missing something. I became my own harshest critic, policing my thoughts before anyone else could. The loneliness was crushing, but quiet. There were no dramatic moments where I could point and say, "This is where it broke me." Instead, it happened in ordinary seconds. Sitting at home wondering why no one checked in, scrolling through photos I wasn't part of, realizing days had passed without a single message, feeling relieved and ashamed at the same time. I carried guilt like a second skin. Guilt for needing reassurance. Guilt for wanting clarity. Guilt for imagining a version of family that didn't exist. I told myself that strong people don't need validation, that mature people don't dwell on feelings, that if I was hurting, it meant I still had work to do on myself. I was wrong. What I was actually doing was disappearing. Slowly, deliberately, and without witnesses. I stopped noticing what I wanted. I stopped paying attention to what drained me. I stopped recognizing myself as someone with needs instead of obligations. Everything revolved around maintaining peace, even if that peace required my silence, my confusion, and my self-respect. The worst part was how familiar it felt. This wasn't new pain. It was an old pattern intensified. I had been trained for this moment my entire life. I knew how to survive being sidelined. I knew how to rationalize neglect. I knew how to blame myself for other people's withdrawal. But knowing how to survive something doesn't mean it won't destroy you. There were moments when I caught myself rehearsing conversations that would never happen, explaining myself to imaginary versions of them who were finally willing to listen, imagining apologies that might soften things, imagining understanding that never came. Those imagined conversations were the only place my voice still existed. In real life, I felt hollow. Like I was moving through routines without substance. Work, errands, small talk, sleep. Everything functioned, but nothing connected. I felt emotionally homeless, untethered from the place that was supposed to ground me. I started to realize that holding the family together meant letting myself fall apart. Every attempt to preserve connection required another piece of me to be sacrificed. Another truth swallowed. Another boundary ignored. And the more I gave up, the less there was left to offer. There was a moment, late one night, when the thought surfaced clearly for the first time. If I keep doing this, I won't exist anymore. The thought terrified me. Not because I wanted attention, but because I couldn't remember the last time I felt real. I had mistaken endurance for loyalty. I had mistaken silence for maturity. I had mistaken self-erasure for love. And the realization settled heavily in my chest. I was fighting for a place that required me to be smaller than I was meant to be. Still, I didn't walk away. Not yet. Letting go felt like betrayal. Like confirming every quiet accusation that I was the problem. I stayed suspended between self-preservation and longing, afraid that choosing myself meant losing everything else. What I didn't know was that I was already lost, and that the version of me who would survive this couldn't be born until something finally broke. There is a moment in prolonged pain where hope doesn't explode or disappear. It simply goes quiet. That was the moment everything changed for me. Not when I finally stood up for myself. Not when someone apologized. Not when things were resolved. But when I accepted that they never would be. Walking away didn't look brave. It didn't feel empowering. It felt like grief with nowhere to land. I didn't announce anything. I didn't make declarations. I didn't draw lines in the sand or demand accountability. I just stopped reaching. And that small, almost invisible decision exposed more truth than any confrontation ever could. Because when I stopped trying, nothing came toward me. At first, I told myself it was temporary. That they were busy. That this was still part of the distance phase. But days passed. Then weeks. And no one checked to see if I was okay. No one asked why I had gone quiet. No one wondered if they had pushed too far. That silence told me everything I had been afraid to admit. I had been the bridge. And when I stopped holding both sides together, the connection collapsed. The pain of that realization was physical. It settled in my chest, heavy and unmoving. I cried in places no one could see. In the car. In the shower. In the space between falling asleep and waking up. I mourned people who were still alive, which is a special kind of agony because there is no closure. Just absence where love was supposed to be. I questioned myself constantly. Was I overreacting? Was I being dramatic? Was I throwing everything away over nothing? Years of conditioning didn't disappear overnight. The self-doubt came back in waves, especially on days when loneliness felt unbearable. There were moments I almost went back. Almost apologized again. Almost offered myself up just to feel connected. But something stopped me. I remembered how small I had become trying to stay. I remembered how my weakness had been used, not protected. I remembered how easily my pain had been accepted as collateral damage. And for the first time, I chose to sit with the loneliness instead of escaping it. That choice hurt more than anything else in this story. Walking away without being understood meant giving up the fantasy that one day they would see me clearly. It meant letting go of explanations that would never be heard. It meant accepting that in their version of events, I might always be the villain, and I had to decide whether I could live with that. Some nights, I wasn't sure I could. But slowly, something unexpected happened. In the absence of constant emotional tension, my body began to rest. I slept deeper. I breathed easier. My thoughts became quieter. I noticed how much energy I had been spending just managing reactions, predicting moods, and preparing for emotional fallout. Without that weight, I felt strange, lighter, unsteady, free in a way that scared me. I started to feel myself return in fragments. A reaction I didn't suppress. A boundary I didn't apologize for. A moment of peace I didn't sabotage with guilt. These moments were small, but they were mine. And for the first time, I wasn't trading pieces of myself for approval. The grief didn't vanish. It still hasn't. There are days when I miss the idea of them more than the reality. Days when I ache for a version of family that never existed. Days when I wonder how things might have turned out if I had been louder, stronger, different. Those thoughts still visit me, but they don't control me anymore. What changed wasn't my capacity to love. It was my willingness to abandon myself for it. I learned that being misunderstood is survivable. That being alone is survivable. That what isn't survivable is living a life where your pain is constantly minimized and your weakness is exploited. I learned that peace doesn't come from being chosen by people who benefit from your silence. It comes from choosing yourself when no one else will. If you are still watching this, there's a reason. Somewhere in this story, you recognized yourself. The quiet one. The fixer. The emotional anchor everyone leans on but no one checks on. If that's you, I need you to hear this clearly. Your weakness is not the problem. Your kindness is not the flaw. Your empathy is not a mistake. But in the wrong environment, those qualities will be drained until there is nothing left. And leaving that environment does not make you heartless. It makes you honest. I don't know what my relationship with my family will look like in the future. Maybe there will be distance forever. Maybe there won't. What I do know is that I will never again earn love by disappearing. I will never again confuse endurance with loyalty. And I will never again allow my weakness to be sharpened into a weapon against me. If staying costs you your identity, it's not love. And walking away, even quietly, might be the bravest thing you ever do.